time, since they've been used by human beings so commonly, that doesn't kill you. So they're generally recognized as safe. And then there's also a list of substances prior to January 1, 1958, that the government has called them as prior sanctioned substances. These are substances prior to January 1, 1958, the year I was born, okay, that have proven to be safe through use by people. So those are also called generally recognized as safe, okay? So if components are generally recognized as safe, do we establish a safe level for them in food? What is your answer? What is the common sense answer for that? If I know something is safe, can I use a lot of it? Why not? If it's safe, why can't I use it? Will it kill me?
Safe for like small dosage, like nitrates when you have meats. You know, add like a little bit of that too.
But is that a grass substance?
No.
So things that are generally recognized as safe are exempt from a residue tolerance, exempt from a tolerance level, safe level. Okay? If you say something is safe, you're saying, so that you are exempting it from a tolerance exemption, okay? So what is a tolerance? So for example, when I'm adding color additives to my food, FDA has given guidance based on, of course, the company coming up with all the scientific studies to prove what the safe level is, and then, of course, FDA scientific panel looks at all that. So tolerance is basically what's called a safe level, okay? So this is the maximum amount you can have. This is the maximum amount, okay? So that's a tolerance level, so. And of course, this has to go through a lot of pre-market approval, scientific studies and all that. Unless somebody sets a tolerance for color additives that is safe today. And in my lab, I'm studying color additives and I'm testing it on rats, and I'll say, we tried it at that level and it has caused cancer in these animals. Then FDA has to revise and review all of the data and revise the tolerances at a lower, okay? So that kind of process is always in play with FDA. So the tolerance is established based on effectiveness and safety testing, but if there's new information to question them, again, they will revise it, okay? So the maximum level of any additive that you apply, especially if it exceeds that level, they set tolerances for it. For generally regarded as safe, they will not be exempt because higher levels will not cause any problem, okay? There's only some substances where tolerances are set. There's color additives and some food additives. And when we talk about adulterated food safety, you can remember that, okay? And then we talk about certified colors. Pesticide residues also have these tolerances established, okay? How much can you find? When you apply chemical to the raw commodity, generally you're not allowed to apply any chemicals, pesticide chemicals in a liquid form to process commodities, okay? You cannot do that. That's why a lot of times when it involves processed commodities, people use toxic gases because they'll go through the food and then they dissipate. They escape the food, okay? They kill whatever there is, and then there's the residues no longer there. Only chemicals that apply, you cannot apply a lot of chemicals to processed material unless you can prove they're safe. For example, tricalcium phosphate, TCP is used in a lot of things as an anti-caking agent. You can use that because it's generally recognized as safe. It's okay to have that 2% by weight in food. Anti-caking agents, a lot of the silica-based dusts or their silicon dioxide you can add in food as an anti-caking agent, 2% by volume you can use. Then that's also a cross substance. Things that are toxic, you cannot add directly to processed food. You can apply to raw commodity, and then what happens when you apply to wheat, a lot of the residue will be on the bran layer. When you remove all of that, when you get flour, the residue is 1/10. If you apply at 8 parts per million, you're going to get 0.1 part per million or 0.01 parts per million in the flour. So, and those tolerances are all established by both EPA and FDA. FDA figures out what those residues are in processed food, EPA, and raw commodities. So residues in processed food are not treated as additives. So here's prohibited acts. These are things a company cannot do. This falls under section 301. So you cannot introduce into interstate commerce any adulterated or misbranded food. We'll go into the definition of what adulterated food is, and I want you to know, you have to know what an adulterated food is, what a misbranded food is, okay? We'll talk about that later on in this next class. And then, you not only should you not manufacture and sell adulterated food, you cannot also receive, okay? If you know a food is adulterated or misbranded, again, everything goes back to knowledge and intent, okay? Did you have knowledge it was adulterated, misbranded? Did you knowingly receive it to sell it back, okay? To dilute it or some other way, so. And then if you refuse to permit access to FDA inspectors, that's also a prohibited act. Under FESMA, now in October, there was a ruling, 2011, that FDA has to be given access to every food facility, okay? And refusing permit, again, is prohibited act. And then, of course, falsely representing an article as food when it's not food is also prohibited act. So there's this whole bunch of them underneath that. And then what are the penalties? Let's say if you are caught, promoting or selling adulterated, misbranded food, you get injunction. Injunction basically is a stop whatever you're doing, we'll seize whatever you have, and then of course there'll be a trial in court, okay? And then there's all these rules of how they're going to prosecute you and all that, okay? To go to courts and what your rights are to appeal, all those things are given in that in injunctions. So here's the thing, I mean, don't worry about the dollar amounts. Basically what it says is, if you commit this, crime first time, or if you violate any of the food safety laws, first time, it will be slap on the wrist. If you're a repeat offender, there's going to be a lot more serious penalties, okay? And if you put adulterated, misbranded food and somebody died, there's going to be big penalties, okay? So that's why every time they do inspection and you have a violation, they come back and check you again to make sure that you're not a repeat violator. Same thing with human cases still of criminal procedure, similar kind of stuff. And then if you're a corporation, they get more money out of you. And then again, this goes the same thing, introducing adulterated food into interstate commerce. So again, standards for food, this is something the Secretary has determined, so there are two things. There's standards for identity, what the food is, and standards for quality. And the Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services determines that, and not for fresh or dried fruits, okay? Fresh or dried vegetables, no standards, because there's always shrinkage and other things, right? They only do it for avocados, cantaloupes, citrus fruits, and melons, okay? Only for those four. And they also need to describe if you're using those fruits in food processing, they need to say how much shrinkage is allowable in transit, because you always harvest them before they ripen, right? And then you transport them to where you want to sell them. They also specify standards for what kind of packaging material you should use when you're transporting some of these products. Okay, so then this is, again, we're going back to the section 406. Who sets the tolerances? FDA does under this section 406, and it gives you guidance. So if I'm a company putting a product out, it's my responsibility to generate all the scientific data needed to support the tolerance. And FDA will review it. And they have their own standard labs where they will double check that, okay? Not only should you provide all this data, but also you need, how does FDA know that on a given product, let's say in a Gatorade, that they used a FD&C color yellow 5 at the right amount? They have to be able to extract that thing back, right? So not only should you give documentation on how to add it, how you're going to meter these things in your company, but also you need to give a protocol on how to extract it, right? When I extract it, I'm not going to get, let's say if I'm adding something that's at 2%, when I extract it, I may not get 2% back because of the chemicals I use, the reagents and all these losses. I may get anywhere, 1.5% of what I added, right? That's why anytime you go in the feed industry, when you add all these antibiotics and all these things, drugs to your animal feed, what is the range? They give you a range, right? What a safe level is. They don't give you a point estimate. That's because of sampling issues. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? The maximum level is fixed, but when you extract things, when you try to find how much of animal drug is in a particular feed, if I take a sample from here, I'll get a different reading. If I take a sample from another location, I get a different reading, correct? That's why they give you a range you have to be in, that's acceptable. Okay. So tolerance is the maximum value, but if you exceed the tolerance, you're in trouble. And all these tolerances are established by FDA. So again, we have tolerances with pesticide chemicals. What do you do with, let's say, your grandfathers, and not my grandfather because I was born in India, but your forefathers might have applied a lot of chemicals to farmland in this country, right? Way back in 1940s, 50s. And then those residues are still there in the ground, right? There's DDT still there in the soil. There are all these algarin, chlorinated hydrocarbons. So when you, then those take hundreds of years to degrade. So if you're growing crops in those farmlands, will some of those residues end up in the food products? Of course they will, right? So these are things no longer used, but because they're persistent in the environment, they still can be found in the food products we consume. So FDA and EPA